Okay, hello, Sol Solaire here. Um, present, Presenting his short lecture course on the physics of consciousness. This is lecture 4 of, I think, 6 lectures. So we started with the introduction, which explained our new revolutionary postulate. Very simple and logical and totally scientific postulate. Energy came into existence in the Big Bang, and it possessed fundamental properties. Everything that exists has to have some fundamental properties, or it wouldn't exist. Like emergent properties have to be built out of, or have to emerge out of more fundamental properties. So energy exists with its fundamental properties, and we are adding to its fundamental properties intrinsic consciousness. So all the energy created in the Big Bang is conscious perception. Locally, it's all local conscious perception. So you're most conscious of things near you. The atoms in your brain affect your conscious state much more than atoms in distant galaxies, because consciousness, like all the physical phenomena of our universe, is local. Local things affect, or things nearby affect things more than things far away. That's true of all this physical, or most, the vast majority of the physical phenomena of our universe. Okay. Then we interpreted quantum mechanics, so showed that consciousness was the simplest way to interpret quantum mechanics, especially since we are conscious and are made out of quantum particles. We explained the 3 realms. Individual conscious particles, that's quantum mechanics. Macroscopic objects are the other realm, the Newtonian realm. Macroscopic objects are large numbers of individual consciousnesses bound together, but without giving rise to any special center of consciousness. And then animals, animate life, and plant life as well produce centers of, or macroscopic objects that have centers of consciousness that can make individual decisions on the macroscopic object's behalf. Yes. So your center of consciousness, and you don't need to have we don't get mixed up with any of the homunculus ideas. There doesn't have to be another little human inside your center of consciousness. It could just be a physical object, a special physical object that has taken millions of years or billions of years to evolve, that has conscious perception and can make decisions. And it makes decisions based on past experience. Okay. And we'll get into how this makes sense of evolution and stuff in a later lecture. One very simple, or one of the best ways to explain the process of evolution is by way of a physical soul that learns from experience and that can make choices. And that's what you are, a soul at the center. You're not at the center of your body, but you're the center of consciousness. Your soul is at the center of consciousness of your body. It doesn't look like a human, it looks like a complex quantum molecule. It's capable of wave-particle duality, so it can separate from the body. It's very plausible with people's accounts of near-death experience, because a quantum object is able to attach itself to or perch itself in particular places. We've seen this with buckyballs, and then it can detach. And it could also detach and reattach. So people talk about, or people who've had near-death experiences talk about this kind of traveling away from the body. This could be the physical object, the soul, moving away from the body consciously, detaching, becoming a wave of consciousness. Thanks to wave-particle duality. And remember, there are such things as buckyballs, which are large quantum objects. So the soul would be a very special physical buckyball. Now remember, this doesn't, by no means am I insisting that you have a soul. What I'm doing is just showing that it's possible to make truly, totally rigorous scientific theories of the soul and predictions about the human soul. And what I will hopefully show to you is that the best way to make sense of your experience that you've had as a human being is a physical, conscious soul. So like Erwin Schrödinger, long before Watson and Crick, Erwin Schrödinger predicted the existence of DNA, physical DNA, an amazing prediction, which I think puts Schrödinger up there with Einstein. He gets less acclaim than Einstein, but I think he's not getting enough credit for predicting and describing the existence of DNA. If it weren't for him, I mean, I think both Watson and Crick have admitted that, their quest to observe DNA, isolate DNA, began with, Schrödinger's prediction of it in his book, an absolute masterpiece. It's called What is Life? Highly recommend reading that. So, Schrödinger didn't get to see his prediction come true. He didn't get to see the discovery of physical DNA, but by contemplating evolution, he was able to make a prediction about DNA. He didn't call it DNA, of course. He just said it would be an aperiodic molecule. It has to be aperiodic because it has to contain information. Periodic things contain very little information because they're just a repeating pattern. So, you know what it's going to be like every time as you look along the length of it. So it needs to be aperiodic so that information can be stored in it, and that's DNA. So will in a later lecture be talking more about souls and making predictions about the physical human soul, because basically it just makes sense of too many different things. But that's not what we're doing today at all. It's just to whet your appetite for how philosophically interesting it is once we start working with the postulate that all energy is conscious. It really changes your view of the universe. And remember, it's a simple change in postulate, but that doesn't mean it's not extremely revolutionary, and it doesn't mean that it's not going to radically change your worldview once you consider it plausible. Because the modern scientific atheist understanding of the universe is that the universe is this cold, dark, dead thing with no conscious experience and no intelligence, and that humans just kind of pop up into existence by accident. Our consciousness just suddenly switches on, and we last for, if you're lucky, 75 years where you get totally addicted to existence. But that was just a great big accident by the universe. The universe doesn't give a damn about you and didn't do anything to bring you about. And then your body ends and your consciousness just switches off for eternity. Which, that's the worst possibility. And that's why the world is such an insecure place at the moment, because we're not secure in our own universe, because we think it's this cold, dead thing that we just popped into existence in, and it doesn't give a damn about us. That's not a good, optimistic prognosis. And that's why and belief in that, what it tends to create is hyper-materialism. And take a look around the world. People are collecting shoes that they don't even put on their feet so that they can set up shoe temples in their house, so that they can worship cheap slave-made plastic Nikes. And if that's not hyper-materialism, and of course, hyper-materialism makes perfect sense, because if you think this is the only opportunity you get to exist, then you better have a good time, because you're about to be non-existent for an eternity, which is actually a psychologically insupportable thing to believe in, which is why it needs to be denied. So yeah, if you think your existence is going to end eternally, like if that's what you really believe, it doesn't matter so much what you say and who you ostensibly pretend to be. What matters is what you truly believe. Most people, because of science, science being the dominant ideology of the world, and then you have its leaders like Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins insisting with 100% surety, which is incredibly arrogant, is hubris. But anyway, they insist with 100% certainty that there is no God. And this basically then people are like, oh shit, well, science is definitely correct because that's how my phone works, that's how the satellites work, that's how my Netflix lights up my screen. So, and now the major scientists are saying there's definitely no God, so there's definitely no God, and now I'm fucked for eternity, and what can I do? Well, ignore that fact because it's too terrifying to entertain, and just, hyper-materialism, try and cram as much pleasure into this one existence as you can. Because it doesn't, your actions aren't being influenced at all by the idea that you have a soul and that your existence here is for moral improvement and education. So then you live a life as if you're just going to be here for this one time before an eternity of nothingness, and yeah, that's bad news. That's not that produces the world you see around you, basically. But as we said in the last lecture, what's the great thing about Dark Ages is that they bring about renaissances. Because now we have this new way of thinking about consciousness, then the universe has changed completely. Now the universe is a conscious living thing. Conscious energy came into existence. It made particles out of itself, and atoms and molecules and stars. And then the early universe starts to look like an awful lot like a brain, in that it's lots of centers of consciousness energetically connected to one another. Okay, moving about into different configurations and stuff. And if all the energy is conscious, all these different configurations will be different conscious experiences within themselves. And yeah, the universe, the early universe and things like stars start to look indistinguishable from very, very immense brains. And then the possibility of intelligences much, 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 much greater than human intelligence start to become plausible. And really, when you think about it, what exactly is God? God is just intelligence, extremely immense, benevolent intelligence. Intelligence so intelligent, so vastly superior to our own, that this intelligence is able to educate us without us even realizing that it's there. In fact, morally, God is obliged to always maintain plausible deniability, because it's morally imperative that we act as if there is a God, even when there isn't obvious that there is a God. If God makes himself totally known, then our good behavior will be just because, or will be too much dependent on the fact that we know God is there. When it has to, for it to be genuine moral behavior, we have to do it whether God is there or not. So God has to maintain plausible deniability and yet still educate us, which is why through evolution we keep on getting more and more intelligent, because the universe, we're grown out of the universe and we're totally connected to the universe around us, and it's educating us. For example, from chimpanzees to all the way up to humans, our experience here on Earth and the way the Earth is very finely tuned to bring about this education through our interactions with one another. And you can imagine we could do that with chimpanzees. We're so much smarter than chimpanzees that we could educate chimpanzees in different ways and speed up their evolution without them knowing that we exist. If you understand what I mean, like this is the important thing about God. God's much, 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 much more intelligent than us. So there are times when we can't quite figure out God's logic because it's a logic beyond our own. But then we spend more and more time thinking about it and observing the universe around us, and then eventually we can work out not God's logic, but we can work out a new step towards God's logic. So, for example, Isaac Newton was a new step to working out the logic of the universe. A lot of people don't like the word God now, so we could say the conscious mind of the entire universe, or the center of consciousness created by the entire universe, material universe, that guides the evolution of the universe to bring things like humans into existence. So to give one example, if all energy is conscious, then the sun is an exceedingly immense brain, and it could very easily be educating us without us realizing that it's educating us. Same way we could educate chimpanzees without them ever realizing we were there. We could just very cleverly set up aspects of its environment without them noticing. That would, with the aim of teaching chimpanzees, I don't know, to use a particular tool or something like that, and they would never know that we were there. And we could keep on setting up scenarios that tested and challenged their intelligence, which would exercise their intelligence and increase it, and they wouldn't think anything of it. They would just be the environment around them that they were interacting with, and yet there would be some intelligence behind how that environment was set up that enabled them to get smarter. That's one way of... So that's a very different picture of the universe, is what I'm trying to say. Instead of this cold, dark, non-conscious thing, which is what modern science is presenting, it's now this... Now it's always been conscious, and it's evolving things out of itself. Because you have evolved out of the very universe itself. You're made out of the very stuff of this universe, and you're energetically, totally connected to the universe around you. Because, and this is an important physical fact to know, all physical objects are what's known as black bodies. And that's a very poor name for what it means, because a black body is actually the opposite of a black body. A black body is any physical object with a temperature, and all physical objects have temperatures. And all physical objects with temperatures are emitting light and absorbing light. You're emitting the same amount of light as you're absorbing, and it has a particular spectrum. So we're all in conscious connection with the rest of the universe around us, and always have been. And this is a much more optimistic view of the universe, because it brings about the universe has. Why would the universe torture subsets of itself? It would mean that there's some point to our suffering, which is education, basically, and evolution and education, which is how you get from chimpanzees to humans. Okay. Anyway, that's all. Basically, that's not what I'm meant to be talking about now. So you can take that or leave it. It's not essential stuff. Really, it's just kind of whetting your appetite for things that will come later. Okay, so today, this is day 4, and in day 3, we did the 3 realms: placebo effect, nervous system. Let me quickly just say, take something like jumping, for example. Let's explain that with consciousness and the nervous system. Your muscle is a macroscopic object full of muscle cells, and they all are just individual consciousnesses bound together, and they have no special center of consciousness, so they're all just performing their own individual vibrations next to one another, bound together. Okay? So when a muscle works, when you lift up your arm, let's say, what happens is all the muscle fibers have to engage in a coordinated behavior. They all have to perform a little quantum jump in the same direction to pull up your hand. Okay, but they have no center of consciousness. The muscle has no special center of consciousness to make this decision. Each muscle fiber is a separate unit of consciousness. They're just all bound together. So there are nerves in the fiber. Nerves in the muscle connected to your central nervous system, connected to your center of consciousness. So your center of consciousness makes the decision to raise your arm, and that decision is transmitted through the nerve fiber to the muscle, and this causes a chain reaction in the muscle fibers are are formed in such a way that when one muscle fiber fires, then one next to it fires in very quick succession. So the decision is made by the center of consciousness in the brain and transmitted to the muscle, and then this transmission, this nervous impulse of the decision being made, it causes all the muscle fibers to make a little quantum leap, all in the same direction. And the fact that they all work in this, they all jump in the same direction at the same time, lifts up your arm. Okay, so there we see how we can start modeling a human conscious body and its actions, which is pretty cool. But today, what's the order of business today? The order of business today is the law of privacy and then the scientific definition of consciousness. So we're going to state the we're going to state the law of privacy of consciousness, as I've termed it, and then we will state the scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, so the law of privacy. First of all, credit where credit's due. I have to say that this is not, I'm not the first person to formulate this law, but I am the first physicist to form this law. The first person to form this law was a philosopher, and his name was Immanuel Kant, a great German philosopher working in the 1800s, I believe. In Germany, when Germany totally dominated the philosophical world, and when philosophy dominated the world as the dominant way of coming to knowledge about our existence. Now, since then, philosophy has gone out of fashion totally, philosophical dark age, and science has become the dominant ideology, the dominant way of understanding our universe around us. Which means no one gives much thought to work done by people like Immanuel Kant. Now, Einstein did, and if Einstein hadn't read Immanuel Kant, and especially if you hadn't read the philosopher Ernst Mach deserves maybe as much credit for general relativity as Einstein, or a very big debt anyway. And then Immanuel Kant as well. See, Einstein was a very profound philosopher, so he knew people like Kant inside out, and Kant talks a lot about time and consciousness. And a lot of affinities with Einstein's work, and a lot of inspiration. Einstein took a lot of inspiration from Kant. So Kant stated this law of consciousness before me, but he didn't call it the law of privacy of consciousness. He just spoke about the thing in itself. Okay, and he released this work, and it was all accepted. This was accepted philosophical fact. It's just been forgotten. The law of privacy. Okay, so the thing in itself. So what does the thing in itself say, or what is the thing in itself? What is the law of privacy of consciousness? It's just the empirical fact that no matter how thoroughly we investigate any particular physical object, we can't know what the object is experiencing within itself. We can't directly observe, directly see what the object is experiencing within itself. Another way to state this law is that the only way to directly observe subjective conscious experience is to be the object that is producing that subjective conscious experience within itself. So let's take yourself as an example. You're a physical object, and within that physical object you're experiencing whatever you're experiencing now. But I can't, no matter how I observe you, I can't see that conscious experience directly. I can just see your body, your brain, and atoms and molecules. I can't see what you're thinking about. If we hook your brain up to a scanner and we tell you to think about a tree, we won't be able to directly observe the tree that you're seeing. Like, you might see a green and brown tree. We won't see any green and brown in your brain. We'll just see neurons. And you'll have to tell us about the tree that you're seeing, and we'll just see the objective manifestation of the consciousness, which is groups of neurons. Okay, so that's the law of privacy. This law of privacy is extremely important and totally essential to a sensible theory of consciousness. It's also screaming out to be acknowledged. It's screaming out to the scientific community, the neurology community, to be acknowledged, because all experimental neurology backs it up. That is, when we examine brains, we never see the conscious experience of the patient. They have to tell us their conscious experience. We just see the objective manifestation of the consciousness, which is neurons and things. Okay, so this idea has been accepted for a long time. It just hasn't been scientifically acknowledged. Indeed, it's why there exists the ancient philosophical concept of solipsism. Solipsism is the idea that maybe you're the only consciousness that exists. Maybe all the people that you see around you who appear to be conscious aren't really conscious. They're just figments of your imagination, or they're androids, or you're a brain in a jar, or you're in a matrix and they're all programs and they're not really conscious and only you are conscious. Now, there's no way for you to prove this isn't the case. The only way for you to know this isn't the case is via intuition, conscious intuition. That is, spend some time with a loved one, your mom, your wife, your dog, whatever, and you will just feel naturally, subjectively assured that no, they're conscious just like you are. At least that's how you're living your life, because life would be a horror if you're there earnestly being a husband to a wife who doesn't actually exist. So yeah, a lot of our modern nonsense scientific theories are awful and dystopian. The good thing about this theory is it's optimistic and life affirming. You have free will. Other conscious beings exist. Okay, so that's the law of privacy. I think that's pretty much it, you know. You might say, who am I to make up a law? Well, first of all, I didn't. Immanuel Kant did. Second of all, I'm a human, and yeah, our laws are stated by humans. Newton was a human. This law has just as much status, just as much validity as the law of conservation of energy, for example. Because every observation we've ever made confirms it. The reason only a human stated the law of conservation of energy, just based on our limited observations of the universe around us made by humans. Now, we could go to some part of the universe where energy is not conserved and new energy comes into existence, or old energy goes out of existence, but we haven't found any region of the universe like that yet, though we have only explored a tiny fraction of the universe. But every experiment we have done thus far every relevant experiment has confirmed that energy is conserved. So therefore, since every experiment confirms it, we accept it as a law. Similarly, every experiment confirms that subjective experience cannot be seen except for the subjective experience concomitant with your own physical form, which is to say, you've only ever seen your own conscious experience, and you only ever will see your own conscious experience. So you can't directly, objectively observe a purely subjective phenomena, and the subjective component of the phenomenon of consciousness is purely subjective. So it can only be experienced subjectively, and we can only learn about it based on subjective observations. That's why your understanding of consciousness is necessarily based in your own experience of consciousness, because that's the only consciousness you've ever experienced. Okay, I don't think I need to say any more about the law of privacy. Already stated by Immanuel Kant, accepted as philosophical fact, forgotten by modern scientists, and is crying out to be acknowledged by modern neuroscience. Okay, let's leave the law of privacy there, because we need to move on to the technical scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, so it's pretty obvious. It's pretty simple. And it's wonderful and logical. Now check other definitions of consciousness and compare them with mine. Other scientific definitions of consciousness and compare them with mine. And you will see that mine is actually scientific and actually makes sense. People keep on referring me to this integrated information theory, and it's not good. There's no law of privacy. The one good thing that they've seemed to have noticed, it was difficult to tell because it's so full of jargon, is that future states are connected to previous states in quantum mechanics. But they don't have a theory of free will. In fact, I think their theory states that free will isn't the case, which is wrong. You do have limited free will. It doesn't have a statement of the law of privacy. It doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness because it doesn't say, it just says consciousness is integrated information. Well, how is the information integrated? Like, that's a function of consciousness. You need consciousness in the first place to integrate information. Information is integrated by consciousness. So it's a circular definition as well. It's just a vaguely suggestive sentence. It's not a scientific definition of anything. It doesn't involve any scientific terms, any terms of physics whatsoever. Has no dimensions. It's, a vaguely suggestive sentence, and that's all it is. It's not a real theory of consciousness. You can't do what I've done with my theory, which is start expanding this and developing new principles and etc., etc. So let's move on to the real scientific definition of consciousness. Well, we've already stated it really. Consciousness is energy. Okay, so a new equation, one day will be a very, very famous equation, is E equals C, capital E equals capital C. E is physical energy, and C is consciousness. It's literally the same stuff. It is one and the same stuff. All energy is conscious in different forms, experiencing different form-dependent subjective conscious experience within itself. So then, what is the technical scientific definition of this consciousness? So, and just to say, when energy is configured to make exactly you, then you experience your exact physical configuration gives rise to your exact subjective conscious experience at any given time. Okay, so then we need the scientific definition. Well, if consciousness is energy, then the scientific definition of consciousness is the same as the scientific definition of energy. And thanks to conventional physics, physical energy is extremely well defined. In fact, since everything physical in the universe is formed out of energy, the definition of energy, technically, scientifically, is the whole of physics. That's all physics is the technical definition and description of energy, the various forms it can take on, and the various physical processes it can undergo. And these have technical definitions, and that collection of technical definitions is called physics. So there's no simple one-line definition of energy. It takes the whole of physics to define energy, technically. And since energy is exactly the same stuff, is exactly equal to consciousness, this is also the scientific definition of consciousness. Okay, but that's not complete. That's not complete. We need to develop the definition a little bit further. Why? Well, because physics, as it defines energy, its definition of energy is totally objective. It's based strictly only on objective observations of consciousness, of energy, only on objective observations of energy. Okay, that's conventional physics. Subjective evidence is not allowed in conventional physics. Only objective empirical evidence is allowed for objective conventional physics. So, yes, so physics, in fact, is the scientific definition of objective consciousness. Okay? So the scientific definition of consciousness has two components. Now, until now, scientists have been trying to define consciousness objectively, and only objectively, saying things like integrated information, which doesn't mean anything. Only objectively. Now, here's the thing. You can't define consciousness only objectively, because it's not only objective. It has a subjective component as well. How do you know? Well, because you subjectively experience it. In fact, the subjective component is more basic than the objective component, because your whole objective study of the universe happens through your subjective experience. So subjective consciousness is actually more fundamental than our objective understanding of the universe. So, given that consciousness involves a subjective component, it's a partly subjective phenomena. It's partly objective, partly subjective, which makes sense of neuroscience, where we put a patient in a chair and we objectively measure their brains, and then we correlate our objective measurements with their subjective testimony. That's why when we're doing neurology and studying brain scans, we need the subjective testimony of the patient because of the law of privacy. We can't directly see their conscious experience, they have to tell us about it, and then we correlate the objective measurements with their subjective testimony. So the definition of consciousness needs a subjective component and an objective component to be complete. This is the first definition of consciousness that includes a subjective component. First scientific definition of consciousness that includes a subjective component. So that's why this is the correct definition. So the objective component of the scientific definition of consciousness is physical energy as objectively defined by physics. It's exactly the same. So any new developments in our understanding of energy, physical energy, are also developments in our understanding of the objective aspects of consciousness. Because objectively observed energy is objectively observed consciousness. Now, then we need the subjective component. Okay, so we have the objective component, then we need the subjective component of the definition, because consciousness isn't purely objective, it's objective and subjective. So any complete definition will necessarily have an objective and a subjective component, and the subjective component. Now, let's talk about the subjective component. Well, the law of privacy means that our subjective experience of consciousness is private. You can't see anyone else's or experience anyone else's subjective consciousness except your own. That means, necessarily, in principle and inescapably, the subjective definition of consciousness, your subjective definition of consciousness, necessarily must be based on your subjective conscious experience as a human, because that's the only consciousness you've ever experienced. So we have this interesting situation where everyone has a unique definition of consciousness that is based in their own subjective experience of consciousness. So my subjective definition of consciousness is based on my experience of consciousness, and yours is based on your experience. Okay? Now we need a statement of the subjective component that links with the objective component. We have the objective definition, and now we need a subjective definition that is logically and consistently linked with the objective component. Okay? So this is how we do that. We say that at any time t, so now we're using proper technical scientific terminology. So you can see integrated information theory is what's it mean? Integration isn't a scientific term, has no scientific units or anything. Same for information. It's just not scientific. Those aren't scientific terms. They're not formalized scientific terms. Now we have my objective definition is totally formal. It's a definition of energy as given by conventional physics. That's for the objective component, and then we give the subjective component formally as your subject at any given time t, the exact physical configuration of energy and particles that creates your body, your brain and body, including the physical connections to the surrounding universe. That exact configuration of physical energy and matter gives rise to your exact subjective conscious experience at the same time t. Okay? So that's the technical definition. So at any given time, the exact configuration of particles and energy that is your brain and body, including its physical connections to its local surrounding universe, gives rise within itself to exactly the subjective conscious experience you have at that time. Okay. So you are wherever you are now, and your body is configured in exactly the way it is. Which is based on your life experience and your past and your history and your memories. That has ultimately put all the energy and particles together into exactly your form. And then you're experiencing, and then it's connected to, that physical form is connected to your local surrounding universe. For example, pressure waves in the air, such that you're hearing my voice. That's from a physical connection to your local surrounding universe, and you have other physical connections. And that's all physical and physical processes, and all that physical stuff is giving rise to exactly what you're feeling at this moment, what you're consciously experiencing at this moment, including your consciousness of my voice. So there we go. That is it. That is the technical scientific definition of consciousness. It has two components, objective and subjective. Why? Because that's how consciousness works. It has its objective physical manifestation that can be viewed from outside, but then within itself is experienced as subjective conscious experience. Okay? And conscious experience is form dependent, so different formations give rise to different conscious experiences, experiences. So you have a conscious formed into your foot, you get the conscious experience of your foot. Formed into your stomach, you get the conscious experience of your stomach, etc. And so that's it. Hope you understand. Consciousness is not purely objective, therefore it can't be described in only purely objective terms. You have to include subjectivity. Now, modern science doesn't like to include any subjectivity at all. It has a prejudice against subjectivity. But since consciousness is inherently subjective, or intrinsically subjective, or has an intrinsically subjective component, well, scientists will just have to accept that we need to systematically and scientifically study consciousness subjectively with things like meditation and stuff, and correlating objective neurological evidence with subjective testimony. Now, subjectivity has crept into physics already without people noticing it, because the scientific method, people say, is supposed to be totally objective. Well, there are some areas where a couple of areas where subjectivity has crept in. One is the Turing test. This is the accepted official scientific way of deciding if an AI is actually intelligent. You have a conversation with it, and if it convinces you that it's intelligent, if it convinces a human interlocutor that it is actually intelligent, then the AI is deemed intelligent. Well, that's a totally subjective appraisal. And we see, again, it's this scientists being forced to accept this subjectivity is consequence of the law of privacy, because we can't witness the AI's consciousness to check if it's really having intelligent conscious thoughts. We can only objectively observe it and then subjectively decide whether it's intelligent or not. The other place where subjectivity has kind of entered modern physics is in the two-slit experiment, where it seemed in the past, it seemed to people as if the consciousness of the scientist was somehow involved in the destruction of the wave pattern. You know, this is quite a famous experiment, you might know about it. But no, that's not actually what's happening. Actually, what's happening is the camera making the observation is conscious, because all energy is conscious. And when you arrange conscious energy into, you know, schematically similar formations, it has similar conscious experiences within itself. So things that are cameras with a retina and some way of experiencing what the retina experiences, and, you know, memory to store the picture in. Cameras are actually experience within themselves visual perception. And it's actually the consciousness of the camera that destroys the interference pattern, but that's for another lecture. So yeah, it's not the consciousness of the scientist that destroys the interference pattern at all. It's nothing to do with the consciousness of the scientist whatsoever. It's to do with the conscious interaction of the camera, the visual measuring device. It's not a camera on your phone, it's a special camera for observing quantum particles, but it, you know, schematically, you know, there's light involved, shining light on the object, and you know, making a measurement with something equivalent to a retina, and wires equivalent to the optical nerve and stuff. Yeah, but anyway, it's worthwhile to say here, you know, quantum mechanics. You know, I'm explaining quantum mechanics using general relativity, using consciousness, and I hope in the future lectures start talking about special and general relativity and explain them with consciousness. We've got to bear in mind those are two huge subjects, two huge and very detailed subjects, and I'm just providing the basic principles. I haven't applied these principles to every single problem, and I haven't, you know, Isaac Newton didn't solve every problem of Newtonian physics, not by a long shot. He solved far less than 1% of every problem of Newtonian physics. It took about 300 years before we could say that Newtonian physics was complete, and it took a whole lot more physicists on top of Isaac Newton. It's just he provided the basic principles so they could solve the rest of the problems. And he solved a few problems himself, such as the moon, or the orbit of the planets, and the tides, and stuff like that he's famous for solving. So I want to say, you know, what tends to happen when I'm putting this theory across is I'm trying to stick with the philosophical fundamentals for constructing a new theory, and then someone involved in quantum mechanics who, you know, very technically involved with quantum mechanics will point to some very obscure experiment and say, oh, well, what about this and this? And, you know, I've never heard of this experiment before. So I haven't explained every single aspect of these huge subjects as of yet, and I'd like help in doing so. So please, if you're interested in attaching your name to theories, then these principles are very learnable and very, very easy to apply. I spend all day applying them to different situations here and there. But why was I talking about all that? The consciousness of the camera in the two-slit. But yeah, things like cameras are conscious. They do have conscious experience within themselves. But so your camera on your phone experiences somewhere within itself the consciousness of the pictures you take, but your phone has no personality or intelligence, so it just experiences light there's no meaning to it. It doesn't recognize what it's seeing, and there's no like self. Your phone isn't a self, but just all the atoms within it have an experience, a visual perception of color within themselves, just like you. I mean, where's your perception of color when you look at something? Well, it's within yourself. Okay. So that was that. What did we discuss? The law of privacy. Yeah, you can't directly observe conscious experience except for your own. Then we did the scientific definition of consciousness. Objectively viewed, consciousness is physical energy and appears exactly like physical energy does. It can take on many different... This is the thing. Consciousness as well is a multifarious thing. Many millions and billions of different possible forms it can take on. Energy can take on millions and billions of different possible forms. You know, energy isn't one simple thing. It behaves differently in different forms and different processes. So, for example, you can take carbon atoms and you can arrange them in one way, and they make a graphite lead for a pencil that has particular properties, physical properties. You can use it to write, for example. You can take the very same carbon atoms and arrange them into the form of a diamond, and then, you know, that has totally different physical properties. You can't write with a diamond like you can write with a pencil. Pencil is much harder, graphite is soft. A diamond is much harder, graphite is soft in comparison to diamond. But it's the same basic carbon atoms, they just have different properties based on the configuration. Exactly the same with consciousness. You have your memories in your brain, and those memories are physical configurations of neurons, and you can have the conscious experience of perusing those memories consciously, and I can peruse my memories consciously, but they're much different memories, different physical, because I had different experiences that formed them. And my memories depend on the neural configuration of my memory, and your memories the nature of your memories depend on the neuronal configuration of your memory. Okay. So that's it. Law of privacy, scientific definition of consciousness. Yeah, and we see that that's actually a definition of consciousness that is grounded in physics, grounded in well-defined physical things. Physical energy. Now, everything in our universe that has physical existence is formed out of physical energy. Like, that's all there is in this universe, is physical energy in different forms. Sometimes it's light radiation, sometimes it's matter, and it all exists within space-time, but space-time itself is created out of the energy as well. That's what Einstein's theory of general relativity says. Okay, so what we're doing here is conventional objective physics has constructed a mathematical model of our universe and the objects, the energy in our universe, and the different forms it can take on and the different physical processes it can instantiate. Okay, so that's a mathematical model, but that model doesn't... Conventionally, there's no consciousness involved whatsoever, because consciousness was a mystery to science. So there's no subjective experience involved in this model. So what we're doing in the physics of consciousness is filling in this, think of the mathematical model of our universe created by modern physics. That's like a painting of the universe painted in maths, and now we're coloring in this painting with subjective experience. Now, but we have to start with human experience first. And then we work by analogy to fill in the rest of the map. So now we've filled in the map of quantum mechanics, and we can but starting with our own experience of consciousness, we can fill in the map of dog consciousness. So we can look at a dog, we can see it has a stomach and eyes, so we can say, oh, it gets hungry. Conscious sensations of hunger and visual perception, and then we can investigate its eyes and see what wavelengths of light it visually perceives and what colors it can see. And we start filling in the map of dog consciousness based on our experience of human consciousness, and then plant consciousness and cellular consciousness and so on, and we fill in the whole map of the universe. And then the more we fill in that map, the easier it becomes to fill in, and eventually we'll be able to even say what the first conscious state of the universe was, what the Big Bang consciously experienced. We'll be able to make plausible scientific deductions even about the first conscious state of the universe, the Big Bang. One possible idea is that the Big Bang was a conscious experience of bliss. That's one idea, because a pleasure-pain model of the universe is, I'll show in a future lecture, is very plausible for the evolution of the universe. So that's that. 55 minutes. Good. That was quick. I think I spoke quite quickly though, so hope I wasn't speaking too fast. Law of privacy, definition of consciousness. Map of objective physical reality, and then we add subjective human subjectivity to this map, beginning with human. So our understanding of the universe, the universe is not centered around humans. Okay, we used to think it was. Before Copernicus, we thought the Earth was at the center, and we thought the whole universe was centered around us. Anthropocentrism. And now we found out that the universe is by no means centered around us at all. However, human understanding of the universe does have its center within humans. Okay, that's one thing that's inescapable and has to be philosophically acknowledged. Our understanding of the universe does start here on Earth and expands outwards. And it does start with, for each of us, your understanding of the universe begins with your human conscious experience within yourself, and my understanding of the universe is centered in my conscious experience within myself. Yeah, the people here think the louder your bike is, the cooler you are, which is what it is. Bikes are too loud, definitely too loud. Now, so that's that. So yeah, our understanding of this universe has begun on Earth. First we just investigated Earth before we looked out into space. Now we're looking at the farthest regions of space. But it started with Earth, and similarly our understanding of consciousness is inevitably centered in our human experience of consciousness. And we expand outwards from there into the future and into the past. And we start systematically and scientifically and logically deducing the conscious experiences of other conscious forms apart from our own. And we build a model of human consciousness that aligns with our own day-to-day experience of consciousness, where we have consciousness and we have limited free will and blah blah blah. Okay, so that's the end of day 4. So day 5, I think I'm going to talk about gravity. Before I talk about gravity, I'll say a few things about how different forms, about the principle of similar and different forms. Then I'll talk about special and general relativity and gravity in day 5. Before we talk about relativity though, just note one thing. When Einstein came up with his theories of special and general relativity, the way he came up with them was by imagining an observer at every point in space. Okay? So for Einstein to work out special and general relativity, conceptually, in his mind, he imagined that there was an observer, and of course all observers are conscious. You can't make observations without consciousness. So he imagined a conscious observer at each point of space-time with a clock and a measuring rod, a ruler. So to make sense of space and time, the first thing Einstein did was imagine a conscious observer at every point in space. So to make sense of space and time, Einstein imagined consciousness at every single point in space. Now, space is made up of energy, and I'm saying all energy and matter, and I'm saying all energy and matter is conscious. So my theory also immediately aligns with Einstein's special and general relativity, because space is totally full of energy. That's what space is, energy and matter. And I'm saying all energy and matter is conscious and experiences time. So again, we have more alignment with conventional physics. We're making more sense out of conventional physics. So thus far we have solved the hard problem of consciousness. We've given the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. We've given this valid scientific definition of consciousness, that actually, consciousness is energy. It has scientific units, joules. And this all aligns with our everyday experience of being conscious and having limited free will, and it also aligns with Einstein's special and general relativity. And it's also selected by the scientific method as the correct theory, because the scientific method enjoins us to explain the unknown or the undefined in terms of the well-defined. So what's the undefined in this case? Consciousness. Because we want a scientific explanation of consciousness. What's undefined? Consciousness. What, according to science, is well-defined? Energy and matter existing within space and time. Space-time as defined technically by Einstein in general relativity. And that's what I've done. I've explained consciousness in terms of just energy, physical energy and space-time. And yeah, it's the simplest way of doing that. So Occam's razor selects this theory as the obviously correct one, and then on top of that, no other sensible theory exists. So it's really it's irrefutable is what it is. But yeah, it conceptually it makes for a big change in how you view your universe. So it'll take a little bit of time to get used to, but what I will say is this, more incentive to open your mind to the theory, is that once you do see this picture of the universe and once you are convinced of it, well, you're more aligned with the truth of your reality, and that brings about tremendous increases in physical and mental health. So yeah, and then you can start, and the placebo effect and things like that. So there's a lot of benefits. So again, I recommend, and lots of possibilities in terms of medicine as well. As I mentioned, the placebo effect. So, do put in some effort into trying to understand these things. I highly recommend it. It'll be beneficial for you. And read the essays that I posted on Our Consciousness on Reddit. Lots of essays that go into more depth about the law of privacy, about quantum free will. So there's a whole lot more you can learn there. And once you're fully familiar with the principles, you can start working on your own theories and ideas. And I can't begin to tell you just how much physics there is up for grabs for you to attach your name to. Okay? Anyway, that's definitely enough now. So day 5, we'll speak about relativity and gravity. Okay, thanks for listening. All the best.